Hello, class. This is Joseph Holbrook. We're going to continue our series on Introduction to Brazil, and we're now in week 5, and we're discussing the emergence of the beginnings of the emergence of a modern Brazil at the end of the 19th century. This is taken from Thomas Skidmore's book, Brazil, 5 Centuries of Change, in chapter 4. So the outline will be about a new generation arises within the military. This is in the 1890s. The end of the empire, the selling of Brazil, the whitening of Brazil, coffee fluctuations, industry and labor, and then there'll be a conclusion. The decline of a oligarchic consensus. So let's jump right into it for the sake of time. So the introduction is that from 1870 to 1910 was a tumultuous period of change in Brazil, which saw the emergence of a modern nation. This began with the bloodless military overthrow of the empire. The monarchy was ended, and a modern republic was instituted in Brazil. There were efforts by the elite to improve the image of Brazil with the rest of the world in both cultural and racial terms. There was the beginnings of industrialization, but there was also difficult with Brazil's major export earners, which included coffee and rubber during this period. There was a breakdown of the machinery of the interstate political cooperation between the various states of Brazil. And there was a revolt among enlisted Navy men that further shook the elite's confidence. So in the new generation that arose in the end of the 19th century, a lot of young military officers came into their own, and among them there were two doctrines that were very popular and influential among these young military officers. The first was positivism, which is a word that we still have around today when we talk about certain approaches to science that heavily rely on empirical study, that we sometimes will call it positivistic. Positivism was a belief that every rationally justifiable assertion can be scientifically proven or verified, or is capable of logical mathematical proof. This rejects both theology and metaphysics, arguing instead for a religion of humanity. He being Auguste Comte, who was a Frenchman and is considered to be the father of sociology, or at least one of the fathers of sociology. He was the first positivist. He rejected theology and metaphysics and argued for a religion of humanity. He was a prophet of secularization. Brazilian positivists spanned a wide range of beliefs. Pure followers of Comte's doctrine were religious positivists who founded their own Brazilian Positivist Church in 1881. On the other side were more pragmatic thinkers who agreed with Comte's rejection of Catholicism, but did not accept his dogma about historical stages and the circumscribed role of the state. The second doctrine that influenced these young officers was Republicanism. The idea was not new in Brazilian history, having inspired regional revolts in the 1830s and 1840s, but it had faded with the consolidation of the empire over time. The new republicanism revived as younger Brazilians questioned whether monarchy, with its accompanying socio-economic ethos, was the best system for their country. The rapid industrialization of the United States reinforced this doubt in a Brazil that remained overwhelmingly agrarian. On top of these changing tides of social beliefs, Dom Pedro II made a big mistake. He was once the unifying symbol of the empire, but now he was physically weaker and psychologically weaker. His colossal mistake in judgment was when he insisted on calling for a conservative government in 1868, despite the liberal majority in the Chamber of Deputies, which has already been discussed. This was the last straw for the more militant liberals. This was after the U.S. Civil War and near the end of the Paraguayan-Brazilian War, or the War of the Triple Alliance. The liberals were very angered by his decision to go against the majority and form a conservative government. Auguste Comte was born in January 20th, 1798. This is in the kind of the peak of the Enlightenment period, and also several years after the French Revolution, while it was still going on and Napoleon was coming to power. According to the revolutionary calendar then used in France, in Montpellier, France, his birthplace. He was a philosopher who was also considered to be the father of sociology, the study of the development and function of human society, and of positivism, a means of using scientific evidence to discern the causes for human behavior. Conflict arose between the military elite and the politicians. Open military criticism of cabinet ministers, which had begun during the Paraguayan War, erupted in increasingly ugly confrontations in 1884, again in 1889. The trouble had been brewing since the 1850s, with a faction of officers attacking the empire for its excessive identification with planters and lawyers, and its failure to take the necessary steps, which would include railway construction, the promotion of industry, the abolition of slavery, and the encouragement of immigration. The government did not take these steps, and the military elite felt like this led to the failure to modernize in Brazil. The controversy triggered a constitutional problem. Let me restate that. That's kind of a torturous sentence. They were upset and in conflict over the failure of the social elites to modernize Brazil. And some of those steps are listed here, with the lack of railways, the lack of industry, the existence of slavery, and the lack of immigration. Abolition in the Navio Negreiro. Only in the late 1860s and 1870s, however, did the abolitionist movement begin to gather widespread support using the same arguments heard earlier in the United States and Britain. The Brazilian counterpart to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book by Castro Alves of Bahia. He was a romanticist poet, and he wrote a book called Navio Negreiro, or Slave Ship. Both of these books, that is, Uncle Tom's Cabin and Slave Ship, or Navio Negreiro, both of these books had a strongly Christian and humanist flavor, and included the claim that man is free neither when slave nor when a master. In the words of Joaquim Nabuco, who is the scion of the Pernambucan elite family, was to become a best-known abolitionist with his publication Abolitionism in 1884. So Brazil came under increasing pressure to end slavery from global peer pressure, actually. Foreign pressure also continued to play a part throughout the Brazilian struggle for abolition. Criticism from abroad helped the elite realize that slavery was an obstacle to the country's emergence as a modern nation. In the words of the Anti-Slavery Society, Brazil does not want to be a nation who is morally isolated, a leper expelled from the world community. The esteem and respect of other foreign nations are valuable to us as they are to any other people. Combined with this pressure to begin to end slavery was an increased demand for labor. By the 1880s, although slaveholders in low productivity areas such as the province of Rio de Janeiro continued to argue that they could not survive without slave labor, the writing on the wall was on the wall and everyone knew it. The plain fact was that they could not survive the labor shortage that was inevitable even if abolition was not passed. As already described, the end of the slave trade in 1850, combined with the low birth rate among the Brazilian slave population, guaranteed that the slave population would eventually completely die out. In other words, they worked the slaves so hard and gave them such poor conditions that they were unable to sustain themselves and reproduce. The law of the free womb. In 1871, Parliament passed the law of the free womb, freeing all children henceforth born of slave mothers. But there was a caveat. The child now born free was required to render service to the mother's master until age 21. Although the law was an important precedent, the more militant abolitionists were not satisfied with this long-term solution. They wanted immediate and total abolition. And so they should. Also, during this last period of slavery in Brazil, the slave resistance continued to increase. The slaves became important actors in their own drama. By their resistance, often courageous, they gave the lie to the racist stereotype that the Afro-Brazilian is inherently passive and unable to defend himself. By 1887, slaves were staging mass escapes from the plantations to remote Quilombos. Quilombo is a Brazilian term for an escaped slave community in a remote area. In Spanish countries such as Colombia, they're called palenques. In English-speaking places like Jamaica, they were called maroon communities. Quilombos, palenques, maroon communities. This brings us to the Golden Law. The struggle ended in May 13, 1888. When the Parliament approved total and immediate abolition without compensation. The opposition vote was concentrated among the deputies from the province of Rio de Janeiro, 7 out of 8 negative votes. It so happened that Dom Pedro II, the monarch, was in Europe at the time for health reasons, so the Golden Law was signed into law by Princess Isabel, his daughter, who thereby won the title of the slave's benefactress. A carnival celebration erupted in Rio as Brazil joined the company of civilized nations. You can see the carnival erupting up here. I have a picture of it. And this is 17th of May, 1888. Over here, this is actually a photo. As early as 1888, kind of a black and white photo, and Isabel and her husband are over here under the tienda, the carpet. So here's a couple pictures of Princess Isabella when she's younger. Here she is with her father. And here's one of the better books on her life by Roderick Barman. I highly recommend it. Princess Isabel of Brazil. Brazil and its society at the time had a fluid color line, unlike the United States that had a very rigid black or white color line. There continued to be no absolute color line like the rest of Latin America, and unlike the post-1890s United States. This made it possible for small numbers of Afro-Brazilians, primarily mulattoes, to rise socially, occasionally to the top of the pyramid. Obvious examples were André Roubaud as the engineer and predominant abolitionist, and also Machado de Assis, Brazil's greatest novelist and founder, and longtime president and founder of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. I hope we'll get a chance in this course to read some of Machado de Assis's short stories. He's one of my favorite writers. So, as a result of this abolition and the labor shortage, Brazil began to encourage a new wave of European immigration. The number of immigrants entering Brazil jumped from less than 33,000 to over 132,000 just 2 years later. As in Argentina and the United States, the large flow of immigrants continued until the First World War. During the wave of immigration to Brazil that followed the abolition, the largest number came from Italy, with the second largest from Portugal, followed by Spain. Italy, Portugal, Spain. So you can see this made it fairly easy for them to assimilate into Brazilian society, since they all spoke Romance languages and could fairly easily learn Portuguese, and relate to the culture. Here's a scale showing immigrants to Brazil by nationality during this period from 1872 to the First World War. Italians, Portuguese, Spanish, Germans, and other. The primary flow of immigration was to Sao Paulo, which is also the most rapidly industrializing part of Brazil during this time. The largest number entered through the immigrant hostel in Santos, which was the port for Sao Paulo, and were then assigned to the coffee fields. These were mostly Italians and Germans, with a few East Europeans who also headed for the countryside. In 1908, the Japanese began immigrating to Brazil, heading primarily to Sao Paulo and Paraná. And the Japanese became some of the best farmers in Brazil. This led to a belief or a notion in a Brazilian melting pot, not terribly unsimilar to the same belief in the United States that we have a melting pot of immigrants, where ethnic differences would be dissolved in the creation of a single nationality. Italian immigrants might find assimilation easy, but what about the illiterate, unskilled Brazilians, overwhelmingly people of color? For the modern observer, an obvious question arises. Why did the planters of the Center-South fail to recruit from the large body of free labor elsewhere in Brazil? I think the author here is referring to the Northeast, Bahia and Pernambuco, and the poverty-stricken Northeast that had suffered from over-reliance on sugar production. In 1891, Brazil had a constituent assembly and elaborated a second constitution. They had been under the first constitution since Dom Pedro I wrote it in the early part of the 19th century. From 1890 to 1891, the newly elected Constituent Assembly wrote Brazil's second constitution. A key author was Rui Barbosa, a Bahian deputy. He's very famous in Brazilian history. The 1891 Constitution's most important feature was radical decentralization. Brazil was now to become a federation. Each state would now directly elect its own governor and legislature, and would have extensive powers such as the authority to contract foreign loans, to levy interstate tariffs, and to maintain its own state militia. The Constitution of 1891 made it possible for Sao Paulo to direct its own development. Another aspect of the Constitution of 1891 was separation of church and state. The Roman Catholic Church was disestablished. The new flag bore the slogan "Order and Progress," a positivist phrase, and Republicans commissioned paintings and graphics featuring a half-clad female figure modeled on the comparable Marianne heroine of the French Revolution. And here's a graphic showing the racial composition of Brazil's population during this same time period. And you can see that the percentage of whites increased, undoubtedly due to immigration. Mulattoes stayed about the same, and the percentage of blacks slightly decreased. Again, undoubtedly due to immigration from white Europe. The distribution of the Brazilian population by major regions is shown here. The Siege of Canudos is a particularly notable historical event in this time period. Canudos was a remote village in the interior of Bahia. It's the most dramatic illustration of the geographical divide between the coast and the interior. And this was a town of several hundred miles from the state capital of Bahia. It housed a religious community headed by a lay clergyman known as Antonio Conselheiro, Anthony the Counselor. In 1895, the community ran afoul of local authorities in a dispute over a failed delivery of wood. The townsmen killed several police, these were state police, in the resulting clash, and the Bahian state authorities called for federal help. The Rio responded by ordering the federal army to end the trouble. They ended up having to send like 3 or 4 expeditions that were successfully defeated by the people of Canudos. You can read about this in a classic book of Brazilian history written by Euclides da Cunha, Os Sertões, which translated into English as Rebellion in the Backlands. He was a former army officer who was astounded by what he saw when he arrived from Sao Paulo to cover the unfolding story for O Estado de São Paulo, the city's leading daily. He admired the defenders' military skills and their raw courage. At the same time, he was uncomfortable because of racist doctrines of the day. He had to regard the locals as half-breeds whose unstable nature boded ill for Brazil's future. A more contemporary book written about the same story in a somewhat fictionalized manner is War at the End of the World by Mario Vargas Llosa. I highly recommend it. And here's a picture of the book cover. The neglected masses. The Euclides' main message was about the gap between the politicians and the bishops on the coast, the elites, in other words, who had an army to enforce their will, and the neglected masses of the interior. Euclides' book made a major impact on the small reading public, despite his dense prose. I have a copy of it here somewhere. Here it is. Here is my copy that I'm in the process of rereading again right now. Any reader of Os Sertões could understand the desperation that had driven the Canudenses to revere their preacher and defend their homes. Antonio Conselheiro was, after all, a lay preacher filling the void created by the failure of the church to staff its parishes in the interior. Coffee fluctuations. So, during this time period, the primary export of Brazil was coffee. Brazil was the #1 producer in all the world. There was an explosion of coffee production that caused Brazilian economy to boom in the mid to late 19th century and turned into a liability in the early 20th century when the world coffee market ran a surplus, primarily because of Brazilian overproduction. Export earnings declined with a drop in the coffee prices abroad, a decline that was exacerbated by the increase since 1898 in the exchange value of the Brazilian currency. Since Brazil is by far the world's largest coffee producer, producing about 75% of the world supply, the temptation was natural for Brazilians to use their market power to try to manipulate the price. But it didn't work out very well. So you see here the quantity of coffee that Brazil is producing, which is going up and up and up to 1907, and then still goes up in 1909. But the value is over here. The roots of industrialization. Brazil had been creating industry on a small scale since the early 19th century. By 1910, Sao Paulo, for example, was on a path that would make it by the 1960s the largest industrial park in the developing world. That's including Mexico City and Tokyo. As the leader in modernization, Sao Paulo was also in the vanguard as measured by such modernization criteria as public education, sanitary facilities, and transportation. This gave Paulistas a sense of superiority with respect to the rest of Brazil. And that is our presentation today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to continuing next week with more of the introduction to Brazil. Okay, take care. Talk to you next week.